Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Star Wars The Old Republic. This is the MMO by BioWare and published by EA that has now been out for a decade, or at least it will be as of December of this year, and for all intents and purposes, this is basically Knights of the Old Republic 3, which is depressing, because this is not what I wanted from a Knights of the Old Republic game. I don't want to play MMOs at all. I don't like them, I generally find them very boring and tedious, and I usually find the business models absolutely deplorable depending on what the game is. If it's one with a subscription fee, then to get my money's worth out of it, I would basically have to play nothing but that one particular game. And if it's free to play, normally they throw in a bunch of really awful microtransactions or make it really inconvenient for the free-to-play players. And the Old Republic is actually no exception in that regard. It started off as a subscription-based MMO, but then they started running into some player retention issues and they decided to introduce a free-to-play option, and as of now, the free-to-play content is up to level 60, and you can play the entirety of the content that the game originally shipped with, as well as the content that was included in the Rise of the Hutt Cartel and Shadow of Revan expansions. And if that sounds like an awful lot of content, that's because it actually is quite a lot of content. The problem is that if you are a free-to-play player, then you have a bunch of very hefty restrictions placed on your account. You only have 4 active character slots per server, which you may think sounds fine, because why would you play more than 1 or maybe 2 characters in this game? Well, if you want the entire story, you need at least 8 characters, because every single character class has its own individual storyline, and it's a pretty lengthy storyline, in fact. On top of that, you cap out at 1 million credits, which is the in-game currency. That probably sounds like a lot. It really isn't. In fact, there are a fair few things, namely player housing, that cost well over 1 million credits, so if you're a free-to-play player, you can't have any of those. On top of that, you have reduced access to a lot of in-game features like the cargo hold, as well as chat functions, secure trading. You have less options for the Galactic Trade Network, which is the player market basically. And you don't have as many quick bars to work with either. So that's pretty irritating. But the business model gets even more annoying from there, because there's 2 additional tiers. The first of these is preferred players. These are people who have spent any money on the game at all, whether it just be buying things from the in-game market for the premium currency, or if they were formerly subscribers, but their subscription time has elapsed and they haven't renewed it yet. The benefits to being a preferred player are that you get some extra cargo hold access, as well as a higher login queue priority, and you get additional chat and secure trading functions. You can put more items on the Galactic Trade Network, you have extra quick bars, and you also have 12 active character slots per server instead of 4. And as if that weren't insulting to the free-to-play players enough, then you also get the ability to sprint starting at level 1, as opposed to having to level up to unlock it. So in this game, which has large maps that take forever to traverse, you already move faster than the free-to-play players do, so you waste slightly less time. But then there are the big kahunas of Star Wars The Old Republic, which are the subscribers, or the premium users as the game refers to them, where you have access to all of the expansions and max level content, and you have basically no restrictions on anything, really. So not only do you have access to simply more content in general, but you have extra quick bars and even more active character slots, and you get a monthly stipend of the game's premium currency, and that's just scratching the surface. There's so many differences in what free-to-play versus preferred versus subscribers can access, and what benefits each gets over the other, and so on, that they have to have a long table that shows all of the differences so that you can actually see what you're getting with either preferred or outright subscriber status. And the simple fact of the matter is that if you are not a subscriber, you are playing an objectively inferior version of the game, even if you're playing it as a preferred player. Sure, it's an objectively better experience than if you were playing it as a free-to-play player, but it's still a clearly and deliberately degraded experience to where you're not leveling up as fast, you're not gaining renown as quickly, you're not getting all these different benefits that come with being a subscriber. It's pretty obnoxious, actually. And don't get me wrong, I understand that it's an MMO and they've got to make their money somehow, but this is still a pretty scummy business model no matter how you slice it. I don't want to spend the entire video just rambling about the business model. I do want to give you some context as to what I experienced with the business model, though, over the course of my time with the Old Republic. So I started off playing it free-to-play, and I very quickly started running into walls with that, and it was getting pretty irritating. So I decided that since I was working on a video about the game for the channel, and I was hoping that I was going to be able to do a full review on it, I went ahead and purchased a prepaid subscription card for the game. That way it was more or less like I had just bought a copy of the game myself. I activate the subscription card, I get access to the content, and since the activation period was long enough, it means I have permanent access to all of the expansion packs. So even though now I don't have a subscription anymore, it has degraded into preferred status, I still have access to the expansion packs themselves. I thought to myself that would be fun. I would play through the game, get all the story content done, go in through the expansions, and then do some sort of combined MTO or review on them. But going into the game, I didn't fully understand what that entailed, because every single character story in this game is very long. And by long, I mean that by the time you get to the end of a given character's class story, you've probably played that character for 60 plus hours. This means that if you want to get the full story of Star Wars: The Old Republic, just the base story I might add, you are looking at a potential time investment of upwards of 480 hours. And keep in mind, that is just playing through the story missions and enough of the side content to be at the appropriate levels to be able to handle said story content. That is an absolutely insane amount of time investment for a single game that is not, of course, multiplayer and highly competitive. Although, the Old Republic does have PvP and competitive elements to it, if you so choose to play them. I didn't bother with those, because I have no interest in MMO PvP. So that meant I was dealing entirely with single-player and to some degree cooperative content, depending on which areas I was in and what missions I was playing. I was also playing this without any friends along for the ride, because everybody I know who has played this wants absolutely nothing to do with it anymore. Thus, when I went into the Old Republic, I was flying solo the entire time. If I happened to do any sort of cooperative content, it was basically just opportunistic, in the sense that there would just be other people in the area and we would be doing basically the same thing at the same time, and so that technically counts as cooperative, I guess. And as far as what type of content and the amount of content I experienced, I went ahead and started a character for every single one of the character classes, and I made sure that for ones that I was playing as one particular type on, say, the Jedi side, on the Sith equivalent, I went ahead and made it the opposite archetype. So for example, with the Jedi Knight, I picked the Guardian, which is a single lightsaber and basically is a more of a tank class. And then for the Sith Warrior, which is the equivalent to the Jedi Knight, I picked the Sith Marauder archetype for that, which is the dual lightsaber-wielding, attack-focused one. And while I went ahead and started characters for each of these, and I played through a bit of the intro areas for all of them, the ones I have played the most of are, in order from most to least, the Jedi Knight, which I actually completed about 3/4 of the story for, at least by my estimation, based on what I know about the Jedi Knight storyline. And then the next one down was the Sith Warrior, which, if my estimation is correct, I played a bit over a fourth of the storyline for. And then next after that are the Jedi Consular and the Sith Inquisitor, both of which I played about the same amount of, which is basically just up until you get a starship. With all of the other classes, I just started them, I played for maybe a couple of hours, and then set it aside for later. And while they do interesting things with the storylines and the way they play off of light side and dark side, and you even have the ability to do light side things as a Sith, or dark side things as a Jedi, and they are all perfectly valid responses to all of the situations you come up against, meaning you actually have some nuance to the way the Force and the light side and dark side are represented in the entirety of the Old Republic. And even though you do have fleshed out NPC companions that you'll learn more about as you go along and be able to develop friendships or even romances with as you play through the game, unfortunately, all of this is rendered moot by the fact that this game is an MMO. The storylines are ultimately written in such a way as to emphasize the player character being the main hero upon whose shoulders the fate of the entire galaxy rests. And while that is fine in a single-player game, this is an MMO, so you've got hundreds, thousands, potentially millions of other chosen heroes upon whose shoulders the fate of the entire galaxy rests. Meaning that for the storylines in this game to work, you have to do a massive amount of suspension of disbelief. The thing is, even if you are able to do that, even if you are able to separate the fact that there are potentially millions of other chosen heroes just like you out there, your agency within the confines of the stories is relatively limited. Sure, you have a dialogue wheel, although the responses are usually just light side, dark side, and something somewhere in the middle, and your companions will approve or disapprove of various choices you make in that regard. But selecting a given character class ultimately narrows down the focus of what your character is to the point where you don't really have all that much choice in the matter. You can either choose to be one archetype or the other as far as mechanics go, but when you go into any given mission, you don't have multiple solutions for problems like you would in KOTOR 1 and 2. You only have one way of interacting with those missions. You can't just go in and say, well, for this mission I feel like being stealthy, or for this mission I feel like being diplomatic. You ultimately have exactly one interaction with any of the missions in the game, and that is combat. And even within combat, you don't have any real agency. The only thing you're doing is following a prescribed set of actions that are provided to you by the class archetype you select. You only have a very limited influence over your stat increases because they automatically improve when you level up, and the only real interaction you have with them is to equip certain things that might improve certain stats over others. But even doing that, it doesn't really seem to matter. All of your abilities are already assigned to you when you select your character class archetype, and while you have to visit trainers in order to be able to use the various powers and abilities you unlock, the set of abilities and powers you get are going to be the same for your specific class archetype as anybody else using that archetype. This ultimately means that the only influences you have over your character are the dialogue options you select during the course of quests and story missions, and the way your character looks. And while the most those dialogue options really do are steer you closer to the light side or the dark side of the Force and maybe give you some extra influence points for a companion, you're still not really doing any role-playing in this thing, and it makes the storyline suffer severely. It is painfully obvious as you continue through the game that the writers were stifled by the fact that this is an MMO and were trying something that is fundamentally incompatible with the genre. A storyline that would work in a role-playing game will not work in an MMO, because in a role-playing game, it ultimately all comes down to the decisions you make as your character. Those decisions have an impact on the characters and the world around you, and you get to see the ramifications of your choices. That is something that is simply not possible with the way an MMO works. How can you possibly do any role-playing in an MMO when, for example, the storyline has you wiping out a resistance movement on a planet, and they make reference to the fact that you have crushed them, yet when you wander around that planet, that resistance movement is ubiquitous. They are everywhere! Because despite the story telling you you have wiped these guys out, they are specifically there for gameplay reasons. They are there to be mobs so you can fight them in order to get loot drops and in order to get experience points. This is the kind of thing people are talking about when they say ludonarrative dissonance, that massive disconnect between gameplay mechanics and story. Obviously, to some degree, you're going to experience that in any video game, but in an MMO, it is an especially glaring problem if that MMO is trying something more akin to a single-player storyline like what the Old Republic does. It is basically impossible to get invested in the storylines of the Old Republic, because every single time you see something interesting, that MMO nature of the game just rears its ugly head. To give you a prime example, one of the Sith Warrior quests involves you tracking down the son of an Imperial agent, and you find out that he has been captured by the Republic, and they are set to interrogate him, so you have to go in and silence him in some regard. And while KOTOR 1 or 2 might have you, say, don some disguises and infiltrate the facility, or bribe some guards, or do some persuasion on some guards, whether it be normal persuasion or forced persuasion, or maybe even intercepting the interrogator, in the Old Republic, you fight your way into the facility, slaughtering dozens of Republic agents, and then you get into the room where this guy is being held, and the guard of the area looks at you, a Sith Warrior who has just carved their way through the entire facility, and then he calls in 4 guys with blaster rifles, and instead of doing the smart thing and having them ambush you, he announces their presence, says that they are a special forces squad of total badasses who are going to take you down, clearly having no awareness of the army you just carved your way through like it was tissue paper, and then you proceed to make a snarky comment and slaughter the lot of them. And while this is just one example of this kind of thing, it is something you will see constantly in any MMO that actually is trying to emphasize some form of storytelling. The story is always going to be completely divorced from the mechanics, because otherwise it just doesn't work as an MMO. The only way you can make a story in an MMO work is if you make it so general that it can apply to thousands, millions of other players, and it basically just serves as context for what you're doing. That is not what the Old Republic is attempting. It is attempting a single-player-esque storyline in the framework of an MMO, and it just does not work. And it's a real shame, because they do try some interesting things with the light side and dark side, and some of those story elements are actually legitimately interesting. But they are completely ruined every single time you get out of those dialogues and cutscenes. Whenever those end, you are immediately dropped back into the world of tons of mobs wandering around the place, even if you just cleared the place out. Or you'll see global chat getting all kinds of guild and trade spam, or people just mumbling about some random thing that has nothing to do with the game. You'll be thrown back into that world where every single quest in the game amounts to go to this location and slaughter X number of enemies either as the quest objective or however many you need to in order to get X number of specific item drops from them, or just to get them out of the way so you can interact with a specific thing or a specific number of things in the environment. You'll be thrown right back into that world where your character has a perfectly normal Star Wars name or something that actually seems normal for that universe, but all around you you're seeing characters that are named things like Big Daddy 42069 or some anime character of some description, or XXX Edgelord XXX. And chances are they are standing there with their own companion who is probably the same one that you have. So you're standing there with your companion, let's just say Vet, And then you're looking at someone who also has Vet standing next to them, and somebody else who also has Vet standing next to them. And all the while, there is just so much crap cluttering up your screen that you can barely focus on anything. It makes it impossible to get invested in the setting and in the story that you're dealing with, which means that you have to focus on the gameplay whether you want to or not. And the gameplay is extremely shallow. You are just going to be wandering around from place to place, which takes a very long time, I might add, because the environments in this game are very large and open and take a very long time to traverse, and as you wander around, you will be encountering generic mobs that will attack you, and so you end up fighting them or running away from them just because you don't feel like fighting them, and then you get to your destination, where you fight generic mobs. Because this is an MMO, and MMOs consist entirely of wandering around and fighting things, whether you're doing it PvE or PvP. All the other mechanics are just set dressing. So if almost the entirety of the game is combat, is the combat at least good? Of course not! It is a quick bar based MMO combat system. It has no chance in hell of being good. It consists entirely of selecting a target and then either clicking the options in the quick bars or pressing number keys on your keyboard. There's no real strategy to it, even though they certainly act like there is. You just press a bunch of buttons on your keyboard and you watch a bunch of numbers flash on the screen until something falls over. And for the life of me, I will never understand why people enjoy that. It is one of the most boring combat systems you can possibly have in any game. And I say that as someone who has experienced just about every combat system that has been put into a video game. And when your combat is less interesting and engaging than the likes of the original Final Fantasy, the original Might and Magic, and the original Wizardry, you have a serious friggin' problem. Cause you know what? At least those games have the excuse of, it was the 80s, they didn't have much storage space or computing power to work with, so they did what they could with what they had. There is no excuse for MMO combat systems to be as terrible as they are. Universally, I have yet to play an MMO that didn't have a terrible combat system. And yet those combat systems have stuck around for decades at this point, so clearly people who play these games enjoy that combat. But for the life of me, I can't figure out why. And ultimately, it is that, more than anything else, that has completely soured my disposition towards the Old Republic. It is that the gameplay is so ridiculously boring that I would literally rather watch paint dry than play it. And what makes it so much worse is that this is the actual follow-up to Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2. Two of the best, not only Star Wars games, but just role-playing games in general ever made. And instead of a proper Knights of the Old Republic 3, we got this. It is just downright depressing. Thanks for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting additional equipment, replacing broken equipment, getting more games for review, whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.